that performing the maximum number of repetitions per training session is going to be advantageous. And that might seem obvious, but there's a shadowy side to that, which is, well, why would I want to just repeat the same thing over and over again if I'm getting it wrong 90% of the time? And the reason is that the errors actually cue your nervous system to two things. One, to error correction, and the other is it opens the door or the window for neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain and nervous system's ability to change in response to experience, essentially to custom modify itself in order to perform anything better. We did an entire month on neuroplasticity, and I talked a little bit about errors and why they're important. Now we're going to make this very concrete and operationalize it, make it very actionable. There was a paper that was published in 2021 from Norman et al. This is a very important paper. It was published in the journal Neuron, which is a cell press journal. It causes an activation of the brain areas that anchor your attention. Remember, we need perception, attention, which they're essentially the same thing. We need proprioception, and we need the upper and lower motor neurons to communicate in the proper ways. And this vital question is what to pay attention to. Errors tell your nervous system that something needs to change. So if you are performing a task or a skill, like you're learning how to dance and you're stepping on the other person's toes, or you're fumbling, or you're not getting it right, those errors are opening the possibility for plasticity. If you walk away at that point, you've made the exact wrong choice, okay? Unless the errors are somehow hazardous to your health or somebody else's well-being, you want to continue to engage at a high repetition rate. That's really where the learning is possible. Without errors, the brain is not in a position to change itself. Errors actually cue the frontal cortex networks, what we call top-down processing, and the neuromodulators, things like dopamine and acetylcholine and epinephrine, that will allow for plasticity. So while the Super Mario experiment, the maze experiment, was only focused on generating errors, telling people that wasn't right, please try again, or that wasn't right, you lost 5 points, the key distinction is that the errors themselves cued people to the fact that they needed to change something. So if you're trying to learn a new skill and you're screwing up and you're making mistakes, the more mistakes you make, the more plastic your brain becomes, such that when you get it right, that correct pattern will be rewarded and consolidated. And you can trust that it will, because the performance of something correctly is associated with the release of this neuromodulator dopamine. Dopamine is involved in craving and motivation. It's involved in a lot of things, but it's also involved in learning. We will do an entire episode paying attention to is whether or not the ball went to the correct location on the opposite side of the net. Remember, it's an open loop move, so I don't actually know what I did correctly, but your nervous system will take care of that, provided I, in this case, complete more and more and more repetitions. Now, if I were to just elevate my basal level of dopamine by taking, 1,500 milligrams of L-tyrosine or something, that would be bad, because the increase in dopamine would actually be much lower, right? We would say the delta is smaller. The signal to noise is smaller if my overall levels of dopamine are very, very high. So I'm actually going to learn less well. So for skill learning, motor skill learning, increasing your dopamine levels prior is not a good idea. It might help with motivation to get to the learning, but it's not going to improve the plasticity process itself, and it's likely to hinder it. Okay, so that's very important. So these errors cue the brain that something was wrong, and they open up the possibility for plasticity. It's what this is a shift. We've heard about, growth mindset, which is the incredible discovery and theory and practice of my colleague Carol Dweck at Stanford. This is distinct from that, right? This isn't about a motivation to learn. This is about how you actually learn. So the key is designate a particular block of time that you are going to perform repetitions. So maybe that's 30 minutes, maybe that's an hour. Work for time, and then try and perform the maximum number of repetitions that you can do safely for you and others per unit time. That's going to be the best way to approach learning for most sessions. I will talk about other things that one can do. Sleep. There's a replay of the sequence of neurons that were involved in certain behaviors the previous day, and sometimes the previous day before that. However, there are also data that show that after a skill learning session, any kind of motor movement, provided you're not bringing in a lot more additional new sensory stimuli, there's a replay of the motor sequence that you performed correctly, and there's an elimination of the motor sequences that you performed incorrectly, and they are run backward in time. Okay, so to be very clear about this, if I were to learn a new skill or navigate a new city, or let's just stay with the motor skill, let's say the free throw or a golf swing or a tennis serve, dance move, novice, so I'm still going to make a lot of errors, don't get it perfectly, but maybe I get a little bit better, or I perform it correctly 3 times out of 1,000. That sounds like something I might do. And there I'm probably being generous to myself. After I finish the training session, if I do nothing, I'm not focused on some additional learning, I'm not bringing a lot of sensory information in. If I just sit there and close my eyes for 5 to 10 minutes, even 1 minute, the brain starts to replay the motor sequence of the corresponding to the correct pattern of movement, but it plays that sequence backward. Now, why it plays it backward, we don't know. If I were to wait until sleep later that night, the sequence will be replayed forwards in the proper sequence. Immediately afterward, it's played backward for reasons that are still unclear. But the replay of that sequence backwards appears to be important for the consolidation of the skill learning. Now, this is important because many people they always think about mental rehearsal as the thing you do before you train or instead of training. But this is rehearsal that's done afterward, where the brain is just automatically scripting through the sequence. And for some reason that's still not clear as to why this would be the case, it runs backward. Then in sleep, it runs forwards. And certainly, absolutely, sleep and quality sleep of the appropriate duration, et cetera, is going to be important for learning of all kinds, including skill learning. We did an entire 4 episodes on sleep and how to get better at sleeping. Those are the episodes for somebody who is hyper skilled, who's has mastery or even virtuosity in a given skill, right? Remember, when you're unskilled at something, uncertainty is very high. As you become more skilled, certainty goes up, right? Then eventually you achieve levels of mastery where certainty is very, very high about your ability to perform, yours, certainty, and that of other people. And then there's this 4th category of virtuosity, where somebody, maybe you, invites uncertainty back into the practice, because only with that uncertainty can you express your full range of abilities, which you aren't even aware of until uncertainty comes into the picture, right? I happen to have the great privilege of being friends with Laird Hamilton. Uncertainty. They're at the point in their practice where when uncertainty shows up, like a wave that's either so big or is moving in a particular way that it brings an element of uncertainty for them about what they're going to do, that they recognize that as the opportunity to perform better than they would otherwise. Okay, so they're actually trying to eliminate uncertainty at the beginning of learning any skill. And as we approach from uncertain to skilled to mastery, we want to reduce uncertainty. And that's really what the nervous system is doing. It's trying to eliminate errors and hone in on the correct trajectory. In more rapid skill learning, try introducing these sessions. They can be quite powerful. And then on subsequent sessions, presumably after a night's sleep, or maybe you're doing 2 sessions a day, although 2 sessions a day of the previous session, right, where you get to perform well, presumably more often, even if it's just subtle. Sometimes there'll be a decrease in performance, but most often you're going to perform better on subsequent training sessions. And there is the opportunity to devote attention in very specific ways, right? Not just let the errors inform you where to place your attention, but rather to direct your perception to particular elements of the movement in order to accelerate learning further. Okay? So to be very clear, because I know many of you are interested in concrete protocols, it's not just that you would only let errors cue your attention on the first session. You might do that for 1 session or 5 sessions. It's going to depend. But once you're familiar with something and you're performing it well every once in a while, you're accomplishing it better every once in a while, then you can start to cue your attention in very deliberate ways. And the question therefore becomes what to cue your attention to. And the good news is it doesn't matter. There is a beautiful set sequences of keys being played on a piano. This is work that related to the motor behavior that you're performing, right? That seems incredible, right? I'm not good at a tennis serve. So if I've done, let's say 1,000 repetitions of the tennis serve, maybe I got it right 3 to 10 times. Now I'm being even more generous with myself. And I do this post-training session where I let my brain idle and I get some good sleep and I come back. And now I start generating errors again, presumably or hopefully fewer errors. But I decide I'm going to cue my attention to something very specific, like maybe how tightly I'm holding the racket, or maybe it's my stance, or maybe it's whether or not I rotate my right shoulder in as I hit the ball across the net. I'm making this up again. I don't play tennis. Turns out that as long as it's the same thing throughout the session, learning is accelerated. And I'll explain why this makes sense in a moment. But just to be really advantageous, because you can perform many, many repetitions and you can start to focus or learn to focus your attention just on the pattern of movement. In other words, you can learn to play the piano just as fast or maybe even faster by just focusing on the sequence that you are moving your digits, your fingers, and not the feedback. Now, I'm sure there are music teachers out there and piano teachers that are screening sessions. Maybe it's the first one, maybe it's the first 10, maybe it's the first 100. It depends on how many repetitions you're packing in. But during those initial sessions, the key is to make many errors, to let the reward process govern the plasticity, let the errors open the plasticity, and then after the learning sessions, to let the brain go idle, at least for a short period of time, and of course to maximize sleep. As you start incorporating more sessions, you start to gain some skill level. Learning to harness and focus your attention on particular features of the movement, independent of the rewards and the feedback, right? So the reward is no longer in the tone coming from the piano or whether or not you struck the target correctly, but recent papers out there showing that ultra slow movements, performing a movement essentially in slow motion, can be beneficial for enhancing the rate of skill learning. However, at least from my read of the literature, it appears that ultra slow movements should be performed after some degree of proficiency has already been gained in that particular movement. Now, that's not the way I would have thought about it. I would have thought, well, because it turns out that when you do ultra slow movements, two things aren't available to you. One is the proprioceptive feedback is not accurate because fast movements of limbs are very different than slow movements of limbs. So you don't get the opportunity to build in the proprioceptive feedback. But the other reason why it doesn't work is that it's too accurate. You don't generate errors. And so the data that I was able to find showed that very slow movements can be beneficial if one is already proficient in a practice, but very slow movements at the beginning don't allow you to learn more quickly because you never generate errors, and therefore the brain it's not open for change. The window for plasticity is never swung open, so to speak. So back to this theme that errors allow for plasticity, correct performance of movements or semi-correct performance of movements cues the synapses in the brain areas and spinal circuits that need to change. And then those changes occur in the slow motion, performing your tennis serve, learning to or thinking about how you're adjusting your elbow and your arm and the trajectory exactly how you were taught by your tennis coach. But trying to learn it that way from the outset does not appear to be the best way to learn a skill. When should you start to introduce slow learning? Well, obviously talk to your coaches about this, but if you're doing this recreationally or you don't have a coach, I realize many of you don't. I don't have a coach for anything that I do. I'm going to just navigating it by using the scientific literature. It appears that once you're hitting success rates of about 25 or 30%, that's where the super slow movements can start to be beneficial. But if you're doing is it's sending a signal to my cerebellum that my field of view is way over to there and way over to there. Remember, your visual attention has an aperture. It can be narrow or it can be broad. And I've talked about some of the benefits of taking a broad visual aperture in order to relax the nervous system. This is just moving my eyes, not my head, like I just did for a second, from side to side. Now I can retest, and actually you get about a 5 to 15 degree increase in your range of motion. Now I'm doing this for you. You can say, well, he gamed it because he knew the result that he was hoping for. But you can try this, okay? So, and you can do this for legs too, right? You can do this for any limb essentially, and it's purely cerebellar, and it's because the proprioceptor increases in this finger abduction strength of about 35%, and the elbow flexion strength by about 13.5%, which are pretty impressive considering that it was just done mentally. So they had people imagine moving against a weight, a very heavy weight, or had imagine people moving their wrist towards their shoulder against a very heavy weight, but again, they weren't doing it. They were just imagining it. Other are the ones that generate the command for movement, not the actual movement. The ones that generate the actual movement are the lower motor neurons and the central pattern generators. So visualization is a powerful tool. How can you use visualization? Well, in this study, they had people perform this 5 days a week. I believe that it was 15 minutes per day, 5 days a week for 12 weeks. So that's a lot of mental rehearsal. It's not a ton of time each day, 15 minutes per day, but sitting down, closing your eyes and imagining going through a particular skill practice or moving a weight. Maybe it's playing keys on a piano, if that's your thing, or strings on a guitar. For 15 minutes a day, 5 days per week for 12 weeks is considerable. I think most people, given the fact that the actual practice, the physical practice, is going to lead to larger improvements, greater improvements than would the mental training, would opt for the actual physical training. But of course, if you're on a plane and you don't have access to your guitar and you're certainly not going to be sprinting up and down the aisle, or you are very serious about your craft and you want to accelerate performance of your craft or strength increases or something of that sort, then augmenting or adding in the visualization training very likely will compound the effects of the actual physical training. There are not a lot of studies looking at how visualization on top of pure physical training can increase the rates of learning and consolidation of learning, et cetera. It's actually a hard study to do because it's hard to control for, because what would you do in its place? You would probably add, there's a replay often of the traumatic event that feels very real, but that's not to say that the replay itself is the same as the actual event. And of course, PTSD needs to be dealt with the utmost level of seriousness. It should be treated. In fact, my lab works on these sorts of things. But my point about visualization and imagining something motivated enough to focus your attention and to perform a lot of repetitions in the training sequence. That's just a prerequisite, right? There's no pill that's going to allow you to do fewer repetitions and extract more learning out of fewer repetitions. It's actually more a question of what are the conditions that you can create for yourself such that you can generate more repetitions per unit time. I think that's the right way to think about it. What are the conditions that you can create for yourself in your mind and in your body that are going to allow you to focus? And I've talked about focus and plasticity and motivation in previous episodes. Please see those episodes. Phosphocholine, right? Alpha GPC, alpha glycerylphosphocholine. See, if I keep doing it over and over, repetitions, alpha glycerylphosphocholine. There, I made an error. Okay, so the point is that alpha GPC, which is, at least in the United States, is sold over the counter, typically is taken in dosages of about 300 to 600 milligrams. That's a single dose, or have been shown to do a number of things that for some of you might be beneficial. One is to enhance power output. So if you're engaging in something like shot put throwing or resistance training, these motor sequences in reverse. And then of course you want to do things to optimize your sleep. A lot of the questions I get are about 30 and you're going to do your skill training at 9:30. Well, taking a lot of caffeine then is not going to be a good idea because it's going to compromise your sleep. So I'm not here at failures. More repetitions, more failures. At the offset of training, having some idle time that could be straight into sleep, or it could be simply letting the brain just go idle for 5 to 10 minutes, not focusing on anything, not scrolling social media, not emailing, ideally not even talking to somebody, just lying down or sitting quietly with your eyes closed, letting those motor sequences replay. Then we talked about how one can come back for additional training sessions, use things like metronoming, where you're cueing your attention to some external cue, some stimulus, in this case an auditory stimulus most likely, and trying to generate more repetitions per unit time. So again, it's repetitions and errors. That's key. And then we also talked about some things that you can do involving cerebellar neurophysiology to extend range of motion if that's what's limiting for you, or to use visualization to augment